Good afternoon. Welcome to the second installment in the series of Sather reprise lectures that the Ancient Greek and Roman Studies Department is offering this spring. Sorry, I'm sort of an old timer. I'm stuck in my ways. And it is a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker. I should introduce myself first, sorry. My name is Emily Mackel. I'm a professor in the history department. I teach and research in the area of ancient Greek history. I'm a longtime member of our graduate group in ancient history and Mediterranean archaeology. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Professor Josh Ober, who comes all the way from Palo Alto, from Stanford, where he is a professor in the departments of classics and political science, and is now a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. I have known Professor Ober since December of 1996. So we go way back, and it has been just a wonderful long acquaintance, and I think of it as an ongoing conversation that I've been having with him for well on 30 years now. So it's a delight for me to introduce him. He was our Sather professor here a few years ago, and in remarkable time turned around and produced the book version of the Sather lectures. The book had the same title as the lectures, The Greeks and the Rational, the Discovery of Practical Reason. I had the pleasure of reading the book after attending the lectures, and both experiences were just incredibly thought-provoking, eye-opening, challenging, and exciting. So for those of you who haven't yet gotten the hands on the book, brought it. It's in my backpack. It was like a party favor I was going to show you, and I forgot. Sorry. It's an incredible read. That is the 9th sole-authored book that Professor Ober has produced in his long and productive career. It's a career that has really been oriented around the study of classical Athenian democracy, an emphasis that started with his really field-changing book in 1989, Mass and Elite in Classical Athens, followed by Political Dissent in Democratic Athens, and then sort of the third in a trilogy, a book that explored the problem of knowledge and expertise in a democracy committed to the idea that all citizens were equal and equally capable. He has turned also to the core question of whether democratic institutions make people's lives better in ways that really matter on a daily basis. Do democratic institutions and open access institutions improve people's human outcomes? And his argument is a very strong affirmative. And that was an argument that came out first in an article, Wealthy Hellas, in 2010. That was his presidential address for what was then still the all these name changes, the APA, the American Philological Association, and grew into his really important 2015 book, The Rise and Fall of Classical Greece. At the same time, he was working on really, really important and hard problems in political theory. And in 2017, his book, Demopolis, which grew out of the Seeley lectures from Cambridge, tried to separate out democracy and democratic values from liberalism, and tried to sort of break apart this very sort of hard amalgam that we live with of democratic liberalism. And then in 22, The Greeks and the Rational showed classicists why we should be thinking in terms of rationality and rational choice when we look at the way ancient Greeks thought about and made decisions. So really, these are just the high-level monographs, but it gives you maybe a sense of the arc of Professor Ober's career to this point. There's a lot more exciting stuff to come, but I know you came here to hear from him and not from me, so I'm going to turn the podium over to Professor Ober.
Well, I just want to thank everybody involved with the initial invitation to give the Sather lectures. It's a sort of a dream of every American classicist, indeed, every classicist worldwide, and one that, it was, anyway, a huge moment for me, and a delight to be able to come back and talk about it again. So thank you for that. Thank you, Emily, for that extremely generous introduction. Having former students who not only are your conversation partners, but become your teachers is one of the great joys of the academic world. So today I'm going to talk about Agamemnon's cluelessness, rationality, and eudaimonia. These are really the drawn from the last two chapters of the book that Emily mentioned, The Greeks and the Rational. So we're going to be focusing today on economic rationality and then the move from utility to eudaimonia. So I start with a quote from Xenophon, who quotes Socrates as follows. I think that all persons choose out of what is available to them what they think is most advantageous to themselves, and they do this. So just simply restated, what Socrates is saying is that everyone, right, all persons, chooses among available options what's available to them on the basis of their own preferences over outcomes and beliefs about the world, and that everyone aims at the most desirable outcome and acts accordingly. So that's pretty much a succinct statement of baseline rational choice theory. It's about as clean as you're going to get as an ancient or modern statement. So I'm going to suggest that this is can be understood not as an idea that's original to Socrates, but it's in the background of the intellectual life of his own age in the late 5th century. And I think it can be thought of not as a theory that is associated with any individual. We can't tag it to a particular thinker, but rather it's a kind of folk theory. It's in the background of what's being said, at least in intellectual circles. So the logic of the book goes from the individual to the state and then back to individuals. The premise is that the folk theory of individual instrumental rationality, that is, doing what you think is most advantageous to yourself based on preferences and beliefs, is a premise of for Greek intellectuals, but it's also a challenge for them. And it shares intuitions about motivation and action with contemporary choice theory. So the question then, if individuals can be rational or can be understood as at least partially rational, because keep in mind, you should always be saying partially every time I say rational. There's no claim here that this explains everything. Can a state be rational in the face of collective action problems? That is, a bunch of different people with different preferences and potentially different beliefs acting cohesively. And I think the answer from the Greek world is yes, but only under the right conditions and with the right kind of institutions. And the next question then is, can an interstate order also be rational? And here the answer is much less clear, but I think if we look to Thucydides especially, he offers the answer that rational enough to be at least partially explicable, to make analysis of interstate relations worthwhile as an undertaking rather than claiming it's all contingency all the way down. So what we get to now is back, having worked all through that, get back to the rational individual in the relatively prosperous classical Greek world. So closing the loop here, the economic behavior is what we're interested in a Greek world composed of at least quasi-rational states, a world in which this folk theory of instrumentality has been generalized as one factor, only one factor among others, but still a significant factor in the choice and action of individuals and groups. So the premise is that through this talk is that through their economic behavior, many Greeks in the classical era do manifest, they do reproduce the kind of normative rationality of the folk theory. Rational behavior drives a growing Greek economy, meaning that there are more people and higher per capita consumption, so more people living better. The hypothesis is that the Socratic eudaimonists, Plato, Xenophon, Aristotle, first recognized all of that. They understood that. They saw all of it as a moral problem and sought solutions. So that's what we're going to be trying to show. But let's start with Homer. It's always good to start with Homer. In Book 1 of the Iliad, as I'm sure you all know, Chryses, seen here, supplicating. The priest of Apollo offers Agamemnon a rich ransom for the return of Chryses, his daughter. Agamemnon says no. Dire results for both Agamemnon and the army. Agamemnon ends up returning the daughter plus some cattle. Jump forward to Book 19. Agamemnon, having seized Achilles' prize captive, and many more dire results having happened, Agamemnon gives back Briseis, the prize captive, plus a lot of treasure. That's a frame to keep in mind as we go forward. So here were truly great Sather lectures. I mean, these are Sather lectures that, man, if I could zap myself back at time, this is the ones I want, or certainly one of the ones I would really want to hear. So this is E.R. Dodd's 1949, The Greeks and the Irrational. And just in case you think that there is no anxiety of influence in the world, my deep thanks, by the way, to University of California Press, who acceded to my, I'm not going to say non-negotiable demand, but my urgent plea that we be able to use this kind of homage, kind of cover. At any rate, Dodd's, following Bruno Snell, posits irrational Homeric characters. Homeric characters for Dodds and Snell lacked an integrated self and therefore could not, by definition, be rational. Rather than acting on choices based on preferences and beliefs, they attributed their actions to parts of themselves or to external forces. So first chapter of Dodd's great book, Agamemnon's Apology. Right? What's Agamemnon's Apology? Jumps right to Book 19. Agamemnon comes to Achilles' tent, seeking to get Achilles, comes to Achilles' tent, seeking to get Achilles back on the battlefield. He returns the prize captive that he had taken, along with a bunch of treasure, offers an apology in the sense of expresses regret, but the apology is, of course, also an apologia, that is an exculpatory self-defense, claiming, and Achilles agrees with this, that Agamemnon's choice was driven by ate, divine madness. So in a sense, it wasn't him who chose, it was this other external force. Okay, so let's go a little bit more detail into all of this. In Book 1, once again, Chryses comes to the camp, offers a ransom, is rejected, despite the fact that it is presented as fair. The Achaean army urges Agamemnon to accept the offer. So we get actually here an implicit counterfactual. Rational Agamemnon listens to the army, unanimously say it's a good offer. Actually, there's a lot of richness there. Recognizes that giving him Chryseis back leads to the best outcome for himself and his army. Takes the ransom, gives back the girl. No angry Achilles, no epic. But so that's the path not taken. But at least it's implicitly there. One could imagine it could have happened. What actually happens, of course, is he chooses to keep Chryseis, sends off Chryses with threats and insults. The eventual outcome is Zeus's plan, which is signaled in the very first lines of the epic, many deaths, much misery. Yet in Book 1, Zeus's plan for all of this death and misery is not yet fully operative. So what happens immediately after Chryses is sent off? Chryses reminds Apollo of all of the worthy sacrifices he as a priest has given. Apollo reciprocates, sends a plague. The cause of the plague is discovered. And so the short-term outcome is Agamemnon sends Chryseis back to her father along with the cattle, the only way he can stop the plague, only way he can avoid losing the war. So Agamemnon, after all this is now H's are going to be things on your handout. Handout is not essential. You'll get everything you need without it if you don't have one. Agamemnon now lost the girl, the ransom, the cattle, and prestige. He's rather put out. He takes Briseis, Achilles' prize captive, as his own. He does so by threat of force. I have a bigger army. I'll come and overwhelm your relatively few, if excellent, troops, and just take her if you try to stop me. So much back and forth. Achilles thinks about just simply cutting Agamemnon's throat, is persuaded not to do that by Athena. They have some debate back and forth. In the middle of this debate, critically describing Agamemnon's choice of seizing Briseis, Achilles says, "Truly he rages with baneful mind, and knows not at all to look both backwards and forwards in time, hama proso kai opiso, so that his Achaeans might wage war in safety by their ships." Keep that in mind. We're coming back to it. Achilles then quits the battle, asks his mother, the goddess Thetis, for help. Thetis calls in a favor with Zeus. Thetis has like world's best favor bank. Therefore, Zeus's plan of all of this misery for the Achaeans is made operational. By Book 19, the Achaeans are losing the war. Agamemnon gives his apology, begs Achilles to return, gives Briseis back, rich gifts, blames his conduct on Ate. Okay, so I want to sort of go back to this account that Achilles gives of of Agamemnon's failure. Achilles' account of Agamemnon's choice does not directly contradict Agamemnon's Book 19 ascription of his motivation to Ate. So Dodge isn't wrong to draw our attention to that. But it does implicitly contrast Agamemnon's behavior to a competent decision maker faced with options in a high-stakes situation. So the phrase hama proso kai opiso, looking backwards and forwards, turns out to be a standard Homeric formula. It appears 2 other times in the Iliad and once in the Odyssey. It never refers to an oracular or kind of mantic capacity to see into the future. It's not that kind of looking forward. Rather, the agents who are said to have this capacity in the other passages are older men in a position of having to assess choices in a high-stakes situation. They formulate a judgment, offer advice about the best, although not the most obvious or most popular course of action. Their advice is typically not followed, but clearly should have been followed, right? So this is going to be the only little game theoretic bit that I'm going to throw up here. The book has a few more bits and pieces like this, but I want to sort of make an argument for why this is valuable. If we start here, and this is on your handout as well. Agamemnon then is going to be in a two-person game with crises, and Agamemnon's going to have to decide to either return Chryseis to Chryses, as we know he doesn't do that, or keep Chryseis. We know he does do that. Because he does do that now, the next step in the game is going to be Chryses, is going to have to decide whether to seek a god's help or not bother to do so. We know he does that. And then we get to this a third note, and this is where the god Apollo is going to decide. Basically, Apollo's not a player in the game. He doesn't have real preferences over outcomes. So he sort of takes the role of nature. So Apollo, with some probability, will grant Chryses' request, will reciprocate, or with some other probability, will not do so. Now, Homer makes it very clear that the probability that he will grant the request, if we have looked at any kind of the way in which reciprocity works in this epic, we know he's almost certainly going to do so. So if he, in fact, does so as expected, then the ball is in Agamemnon's court. He has to decide to return Chryseis with big gifts or offer no restitution and basically lose the war. So all of these possible outcomes are just given ordinal, that is, rank ordered outcomes from best to worst, and Agamemnon ends up there, as we know. This is how the thing actually comes out. Now Agamemnon really would prefer outcome gamma here. You see, he gets his highest payoff if he keeps the girl, Chryses seeks the god's help, and there's no reciprocity, and he just wins. But that's not going to happen because of the very low probability that that's going to happen. So in the end, we're going to end up here. Well, it's not where you should end up. His payoff is his second worst, 0 being the very worst, losing everything. If he doesn't pay restitution and loses the war, but it's like the second worst outcome. And in fact, what he should have done is worked his way all the way back and should have turned over the girl, right? That's going to give him the best. Now, 2, it's not that great, but that's the best he's got. That's his best available outcome. And so, therefore, that's what he should have done. That is his rational choice. The point of going all through this is that the next game played between Agamemnon and Achilles has exactly the same form. Right, exactly the same form. It's just that Achilles is standing in now for Chryses. We have a different god, Zeus, standing in for Apollo, but the whole thing goes exactly the same way. So this is part of the advantages of this kind of formalization. It just allows you to see how identical the situations in fact are. So without pressing it too hard, what I suggest is we think of this formula, hama proso kaio piso, as a kind of emic that is internal to the culture, Homeric account of rationality. That is, a capacity to connect preferences over outcomes with coherent beliefs and an estimation of probability, taking into account the likely behavior of other players in the game. And the whole idea is thinking forwards and backwards is basically looking up the game tree, thinking about what other players are going to do, and then back down the game tree and deciding what you should do right at the moment. Yeah, that's what a rational actor does. Oh damn. How did that happen? What did I do? That's not good. Okay. All right. Here we go. All right, here we are. Sorry. So anyway, so that is the what the rational actor should do, and that is formally what game theorists call backwards induction. Backwards induction, often typically thought to be a really complicated thing that you have to have a whole lot of mathematical apparatus to really understand. It's not, and I suggest that Homer understood it. It's important to see that that sort of rational capacity is rare, doesn't come up very often, and it's ineffective when it does come up in Homer's world. Homer can conceive of a rational agent who's capable of doing that, but it doesn't really affect the outcome of the epic. So Achilles, Hector, other characters are like Agamemnon, clueless. They're clueless in, they ought to be able to do this kind of fairly simple backwards induction. They can't. They choose courses of action that lead to outcomes that are predictably bad for themselves as well as for the army and others. Okay, well, jump to, that's the world, right? That's sort of a world in which we have the conception of rationality, at least Homer can conceive of it, but it doesn't have a lot of effect in the world. So that's the world that Moses Finley talked about in his great book, The World of Odysseus in 1954, like Dodd's employing anthropology to illuminate antiquity. His key argument, Finley's key argument, was that exchange in the Homeric, that is early Greek society, was not based on rational market behavior. Rather, following Marcel Mauss' great book, The Gift, Homeric exchange was based on personal relationships, on reciprocity in giving and receiving gifts. Okay, so if you're going to have peaceful exchange in Homer, it's going to be that. It's going to be reciprocity, just like between Chryses and Apollo, for example. And of course, also on violence. How did Chryses and Briseis get into the Achaean camp as well? It was violence. So all of the loot in all of these tents is heaped up through simply taking things, the powerful doing what they will. Homer's Achaeans were, in a sense, roving bandits, a term popularized by Manker Olson. So jump now with me for a moment to Thucydides, who was very interested in roving bandits. In early times, says Thucydides, all Greeks lived in miserably unsettled, penurious conditions due to the inability of their little communities to defend against the bandits who roved at will by land and sea and took whatever they wanted. So you had poverty, a very impoverished world. He makes a big point of this. The motive of these strong men was personal gain, once again, instrumental rationality, building coalitions of followers to share the loot, but only in order to increase their strength. So key for Thucydides, big part of his great text, is the dramatic growth of methods of social organization, of state power and wealth in the Greek world since the Homeric period to his own time. So he explicitly says that the Peloponnesian War was a vastly smaller or greater scale, than the Trojan War, and it's because of all of these increases. The Homeric world was simply small and relatively poor in his estimation. Well, certainly Thucydides was right about this. The world of Pericles was much wealthier than the world of Odysseus. And as we now know, the world of Plato and Aristotle continued that relatively prosperous trend. And Emily, once again, mentioned this book, Rise and Fall of Classical Greece. I argue that in a lot of detail. I'm not going to argue it here. This is just a time scale from 1300 BCE up to 1900 CE, and just trying to estimate, and these are really coarse estimates, but roughly population times consumption. However off these particular numbers are, there's no question that we get a remarkable efflorescence in the classical period. It's much richer than the Homeric period, and much richer actually than the pre-modern normal of the Greek world. That growth was driven in part by market exchange. And once again, I'm not going to argue this. Read Alain Bresson's book. I think it's pretty definitive. Okay, so ultimately, in the next great work that Finley published, The Ancient Economy in 1973, or the great work on economics specifically, really doubles down on this world of Odysseus theory. So here he says it's not just Homer's world that had the characteristics, gift exchange and so on. Social status, not capital accumulation, is what always motivated the Greeks and the Romans as well, according to Finley. And therefore, there was no meaningful economic growth over time in classical antiquity. Couldn't be. No meaningful material progress. Never anything like economically rational supply and demand style market exchange. It turns out it's just wrong. I mean, that's just not true. As I think it's pretty closely universally accepted now. So certainly status matters a lot. I mean, it's not that everything Finley said was wrong, but certainly his conclusions about the static ancient economy was wrong. So how does somebody so smart get it so wrong? And I would suggest it's because of method. Finley was a very strong sort of historicist. His historical method in the ancient economy largely ignores archaeology, numismatics, and documents. It focuses on specific passages in literary texts and uses these following assumptions. First, texts are a more or less direct reflection of the ideology, the social attitudes of their elite authors. So we can read off attitudes from texts pretty directly, and then elite attitudes then, because the authors are representative of an elite social stratum. Elite attitudes then, second assumption, drive social practice all the way down. That is what's doing the work. How elites think about social status basically determines the practice, or what we would call economic practices. So the alternative, I would suggest, is a different kind of historicism, a critical historicism. And the suggested method is read the texts, I'll be talking about philosophical texts from here on, as critical commentaries on social practices, and not just transparently a window into, rather they are critical. So the hypothesis here is that Plato and Aristotle demonstrate knowledge of rational economic behavior, but their attitudes do not reflect those of most classical era Greeks. So they understood it, they didn't like it for their own philosophical reasons, but that doesn't mean that they were standard attitudes. these writers are not merely exemplars of elite aristocratic sensibilities, and we cannot read off an elite world from them. Rather, they're self-consciously critical of prevailing attitudes and practices, and for philosophical reasons they are critical. They reveal the rationality, then, of classical Greek practices while contrasting bad economic ends, morally bad, with good ethical eudaimonism. Okay, that's going to be their whole point. So let's go quickly through bits of the Republic. Starts out with, after Socrates is turned around, going to the house of Cephalus. Elderly Cephalus greets him. And the question then is whether it's Cephalus' character or his money that allows him to claim that wealth is merely a useful instrument that enables an equitable person, an epiikes like himself, to be honest in all matters. So Socrates then sort of has a little detour. Gee, Cephalus, did you mostly inherit your wealth, or did you make it yourself? And Cephalus hedges some of each. Now, he is a middle-level moneymaker, krematistes. His grandfather, Cephalus I, was an expert, multiplying the family fortune many times over. His father was an incompetent who lost a lot of money and left Cephalus II in some difficulties. Cephalus II then says, I'm confident if I can pass on to my heirs not less, but a little more than I inherited. In other words, he had to make some of it back up. He didn't just inherit it all. And at this point, Socrates says, I didn't think you seemed like one of those moneymaker people. You don't seem to have that attitude. So Socrates expresses some scorn for money making. Meanwhile, then, Cephalus, asked to define justice, defines it as paying what is owed. And Socrates immediately offers a refutation. Man borrows a knife from another man who then goes mad. Returning the knife is, under the circumstances, wrong. The madman is going to do harm with the knife. So the whole paying back what is owed can't be right. That can't be the soul. That can't be what justice means. Cephalus says, okay, fine. I have to go do some prayers. I'm going to pass on my role to my son, Polemarchus. Polemarchus proposes an instrumental account of justice: hurt enemies, help friends. Justice, therefore, is a useful mean to other ends. Socrates presses this madman's knife issue. So if two people are friends and one gives back money deposited with him to the other when the exchange is going to cause harm, the one returning the money is not giving the other what is owed to him. Okay? Extrapolation from the knife. And quickly, Socrates leads Polemarchus into the unlikely conclusion that the just man is only of use in money matters when the money is deposited, what it means like securely tucked under the just man's mattress, and is, as such, simply inert. So Polemarchus is not described as even a moderately expert krematistes, seems to be interested in other things entirely. But imagine, instead of him answering these questions about how money is justly given back and so on, imagine it was Cephalus I, Socrates, who was Socrates' interlocutor. So in this case, I would argue we would never have gotten to this point in the dialogue. Cephalus I did not multiply his fortunes many times over by depositing his money into some kind of inert account. His creative approach to money making meant that if he deposited money with somebody else, he expected on a return of principal plus interest, tokos in Greek. The person to whom the loan was made, in order to produce the expected interest, would have to also have put it to work. So Cephalus I inhabits a very different world than the one that Polemarchus ends up getting pushed into by Socrates. Let me give sort of the first, can't bring back Cephalus the first, but let's think a little bit about Cephalus II on epieikeia. Socrates' foreclosure of the topic of fair, creative money-making blocks the path of defining justice as epieikeia, as equity or decency. That is the cardinal virtue that Cephalus II claimed for himself. What is an epieikeis? What does it mean, epieikeia? Now, we pretty much have to get to really clean definition. We have to go to Aristotle, who says that he is one who by choice and in practice does what is equitable, and who is not a stickler for the letter of the law, but is content to receive a lesser share, although he has the law on his side. So epieikeia corrects errors arising from the strict application of general rules that by the very nature of generality cannot attend to particulars. Okay, so here's a speculation, continuing the counterfactual. Cephalus the epieikeis, as a member of a commercial community, remember he is a moneymaker, interprets his community's understanding of the pay your debts rule in light of the relevant particulars. That's how they think about things. He withholds the borrowed knife from the madman and expects to be praised, not blamed, for having done so. The knife's owner, assumed also to be an epieikeis, in the same community would ex ante, before going mad, accept the fairness of receiving a lesser share in the case of his own subsequent loss of sanity. Everyone agrees this is an exception to the general rule, and an important one. So the payoff then is that Socrates' scorn for money-making, Cephalus walks off pretty quickly in this, and Cephalus' untimely exit shuttered a window onto Greek economic rationality. We don't get to hear about what we'd like to hear about what the world of the epieikeis would actually be like, a world in which, of course, we have rules, but all rules have exceptions in order to assure that the rules simply don't end up in a place that none of us want to be. Back to Socrates and Polemarchus. I'm skipping over a couple of things in the handout just because I had too many slides. We have a decisive turn in the story. Socrates trots out a familiar analogy. The general is expert at stealing enemy plans as well as making his own plans. The doctor can make people ill as well as heal them. And so for whatever someone is a skillful guardian, a deinos phulax, he will also be a skillful thief. Oh, Polemarchus, I guess so. Socrates, and then the just person is good at guarding money. He'll also be good at stealing it. Gee, that's the way we seem to be going. Socrates, then it appears that the just man is unveiled as some kind of thief. And you're likely to have learned that from, guess who? Homer. For I tell you, he's fond of Autolycus, Odysseus' maternal grandfather, and says he excelled all men in thieving and perjury. The point here is that the Homeric reference suggests a continuity between a theft-based, Homeric roving bandit economy and classical money-making. It's almost Finley anticipated. And furthermore, the foreshadowing of the Republic Book 2, the phulax, right? The guardian, the dangerous guardians, the guardians who are said in Book 2 to be dangerous, were they not properly educated, would seize the property of the defenseless producers. So once again, we're doing some work in that little passage. The implication then is the activity of the epieikeis, the krematistes, is rational but bad. Leads you to a bad outcome. Okay, so one other bit in the Republic, the so-called first polis. We're going to design a city in logos, in argument. And the question then we can ask is, should we conclude that Plato had no interest in or understanding of the economic processes that had created the material conditions of his own world? I think the answer is no. The first polis, the first version of this city in argument, establishes an economic foundation for the truly developed polis, the Kallipolis, that is the topic of the main dialogue. Now, although simple and healthy, the first polis is predicated on interdependence. Socrates says they, that is all humans in communities, each share things with each other, and if there is something to share or exchange, if there is something to share, or they exchange them, believing that it is better for each of them in this way. Okay. So the original members of the first polis are a farmer, house builder, weaver, shoemaker, and anyone else to deal with our physical needs. Each specializes, importantly, in one activity. The subsistence alternative in which each provides all of the relevant necessities for himself, right? Okay, I'm going to farm in the morning, I'll make shoes in the afternoon and build a house in the evening, whatever, is rejected as hopelessly inefficient, just right off the bat. Socrates says then, indeed, as a result of this specialization, all of these things, the necessities of life, food, housing, etc., grow more plentiful and become better and easier when one man does one job according to his aptitudes and opportunities and leaves everything else alone. Adam Smith would agree with this, I think, without demur. This is the basic idea of the pin factory. If you're going to make a bunch of pins, you don't want to have each guy making the whole pin from the beginning to the end. You want to have one person drawing the wire and one person doing whatever the hell else it is that make pins. So it's an efficiency principle, right? Finley, back to Finley, denied that efficiency was ever even noticed by the Greeks. The very possibility of a Greek writer grasping Adam Smith's economic principles was rejected. Quote, the very few ancient writers who mention division of labor at all do so in a context or from a point of view where they're essentially different from Adam Smith's. They're interested in the quality of manufacture, not in quantity or efficiency. Indeed, the very notion of efficiency is one of the best examples of a missing concept, which, though taken as self-evident by us moderns, turns out to be missing in such contexts throughout antiquity. Smith, I think, would say, what? Didn't we just talk about efficiency? So Finley assumes that literature here, in this quote, accurately represents social reality. I mean, there is his strong historicism. So infrequency of literary references to a division of labor prove its unimportance. If a conception is missing in literature, the associated practices were absent in antiquity. Okay, so I've already argued that's the wrong method. But furthermore, Finley never cited Republic 370c, not exactly an obscure passage in an obscure author. And I don't know why he didn't. So his claim of missing efficient is simply contradicted by the passage that we looked at, which mentions not only quality, Finley's point, but also quantity, the amount of goods, and efficiency, the ease with which goods are produced. So the passage itself demonstrates that this is not a missing concept, maybe rare, but it is certainly not missing. It is, I think, an analytically coherent package. Plato's description of the first polis is evidence, I believe, for his firm grasp on the basic economic processes that were operative in his own world and for his critical stance towards them. So just finishing off quickly the first polis, there are going to be imports. There are no imports without exports, so we have to manufacture things that people foreign to ourselves will want. We'll aim at external markets. We have to know the preferences of exchange partners. They're going to be merchants and expert sailors. Furthermore, sharing surplus obviously will be affected through buying and selling, so there's going to be an agora, and coinage as a token of exchange value, full-time retail traders to organize internal trade, as well as manual workers who won't be worthy of membership. So the first polis, I would suggest, is a lesson in basic microeconomics. Because the first polis lacks the counterintuitive features of Callipolis, it's well suited to offering Plato's readers a basic course in economics. You don't have to have all those specialized stuff. We don't have guardians. We don't have equality of women. We don't have philosopher kings in the first polis. In comparison to a counterfactual, inefficient, impoverished subsistence regime, more and better goods are efficiently produced, exchanged, and made available for consumption. The basic principles are here presented as universal, foundational for any organized community, not just for the specialized Callipolis. So in conclusion, Plato understood the economic drivers of welfare and growth at the micro level of the preferences and beliefs of interdependent choice-making agents. So remember that quote from Plato, believing it is they specialized, believing it is better for each of them in this way to, in fact, have specialization, and the Xenophon quote, what they think is most advantageous to themselves. And once again, this is just instrumental rationality. So the Republic is ultimately a critique, I think, of economic rationality, an economy based on specialization and of production and exchange risks becoming unconstrained, unregulated, unhealthy growth by Plato's standards. That potential arises from the desire-driven preferences and the false beliefs, like the beliefs that money is actually a good thing in and of itself, of instrumentally rational agents. In contrast, the first polis is meant to be self-regulating. Its residents somehow lack desires for luxury. They moderate their other desires, include the reproduction. And Callipolis, when it is introduced, is regulated, obviously, by philosopher kings. Compare descriptive reality, Plato looking outside of himself. The residents of Greek polis are indeed unregulated, driven by what for Plato was ultimately destructive, unbounded economic rationality. And worse yet, dangerously effective rationality was exacerbated by sophistic teaching and institutionalized in state-level rules and cultural norms. Well, Aristotle didn't think much of Callipolis, at least as on many grounds. But he also just says basically that Plato makes a category error and invites a commons tragedy. That which is common to the greatest number of owners receives the least attention. People care most for their private possessions and for what they own in common less, or only so far as it falls to their own individual share. For in addition to the other reasons, they think less of it on the grounds that someone else is thinking about it, just as in household management, a large number of slaves sometimes gets worse service than a smaller number. This is this passage cited by Elinor Ostrom, who worked on this classic problem of the commons tragedy and got a Nobel Prize for it. I'm not suggesting that Aristotle should have gotten it instead. Okay, so if we go to Aristotle's own critique of economic rationality, it's quite detailed. We won't go through it today. Basically, in Politics, Book 1, we get a development of the idea of krematistike, that is, expert knowledge of relationship between production, exchange, and consumption, all involving coined money, put into a normatively correct place in a naturalized hierarchy of value. His critical conclusion, krematistike is okay if it's a subordinate part of oikonomia. It is a techne that arises from practical experience, doesn't exist according to nature. Its aims are the possession and increase of wealth as an end, and such accumulation is unbounded and unconstrained. You can heap up as much money as you want. Wealth denominated in money has no natural limit, and so it tends to escape where it should be in the hierarchy of values. So Aristotle suggests that krematistike is a prevalent approach to the management of material goods and potentially an important instrument for both the oikonomos, the person who runs a household, and the politikos, who is rightly aiming at eudaimonia. So he doesn't say it's just evil all the way down, just says it's got to be kept in its right place. But it all too readily devolves into an end, maximizing on a single resource, wrongly thought to give access to all other resources, that is, money gives you everything, rather than being a means for developing virtues. And when unbounded, it becomes contrary to eudaimonia, which is the true end of human existence for Aristotle. So in brief, just like Aristotle, like Plato, Aristotle shows he knows enough about this dangerous, and he says vulgar, instrument to specify its proper uses. It's not that he's ignorant of it. He knows quite well how this works, while refusing to honor it as a science worthy of detailed treatment. So just quickly on conclusions of the book. Revisiting ways in which the Greeks thought about, wrote about, and acted on the basis of practical reason or instrumental rationality, we can recognize the value of integrating social science with humanistic studies for both humanists and social scientists. So rational choice theory, I think, can be added to the toolbox of classical scholarship, highlighting some otherwise obscure facets of our text. We'll see some things we wouldn't see by looking through that filter. Moreover, showing how literary texts both recognize the significance of rationality and underline its limits, constrains the ambitions of rational choice. Rational choice all the way down gets way too many things wrong about the world, completely throwing it out and trying to live in a world in which you suppose that there is no rationality will also, I think, get in the way of understanding the world. But anyway, if I can convince you of that, then we have 5 conclusions very quickly. First conclusion, the discovery of practical reason, the subtitle of my book, is the formalization of a Greek folk theory of instrumental rationality. The sophists, I think, are key here, although they didn't invent it, but they formalized it and taught it to elites in strong, indeed weaponized forms, as both a norm, this is the way the world is, you should internalize it, and as a skill set, and here's how you use it to take advantage of other people. Philosophers and historians, among others, sought to better understand and further formalized elements of the folk theory. They tried to think about how to, and we can see that's happening with Plato and Aristotle. But by the classical period, self-consciously strategic reasoning aimed at maximizing expected advantage then was quite widespread across individuals, across states, even across interstate relations to some degree. And this was not just a matter of elite intellectuals. Instrumental rationality was actually part of the economic behavior of ordinary Greeks. So second conclusion, theories of rational choice have a long history. It's not something that just, the elements of the folk theory antedate the sophistic and Socratic formalizations. there is no innocent age of completely pre-rational thought. We don't have, at least Homer is able to conceive of it, even if it's not thought to be highly effective. Rational choice theory was not simply a 20th century invention, and so there's no innocent age of pre-rational choice Western thought and practice. So trying to get out before this way of thinking came in is simply fantastic, not in its positive sense. And the gap between evaluative and normative theories and behavioral or psychological practices has also long been recognized and explored. The theory says everyone will act this way. They clearly do not. There's gaps between the theory and the practice, and that's quite well understood. We don't have to wait for behavioral economics to tell us that. Third conclusion, ancient Greeks are less foreign than we might think. So if the ancient Greek past is a foreign country, it's a country whose language, or at least some parts of that language, can be translated for ourselves. And Bernard Williams pointed this out 30 years ago, by the way, in his own Sather lectures. He was, P.S., a student of E.R. Dodds. Dodds gave his lectures exactly 60 years before mine, and Williams 30 years before mine, so there's a bit of a continuity somewhere. Fourth conclusion, instrumental rationality was a critical target of philosophical eudaimonism. Unchecked instrumental rationality threatened to undermine conventional Greek ethical commitments, and it threatened to impede the development of what the philosophers thought as higher forms of ethical reasoning. And therefore, one of the primary purposes of eudaimonistic philosophy was demonstrating what was wrong with instrumental rationality, right? Why it's a problem. But finally, instrumental rationality was also a foundation for the ancient eudaimonism, eudaimonists, and indeed for us, the Greek eudaimonists accepted basic tenets of the folk theory. People are self-interested, although not necessarily narrowly egoistic. Rationality requires orderly preferences and coherent beliefs. Social organization must address the challenge of rational non-cooperation, and states can be rational only if they have rational leaders and or institutions and norms that incentivize cooperation, disincentivize non-cooperative behavior. And therefore, for good or ill, instrumental rationality, rational choice, was built into the very foundations of Greek ethical thought and thus into the foundations of Western civilization. Now, finally, I hope to convince my readers that by revisiting the various ways in which the Greeks did indeed think about and wrote about and acted on the basis of practical reason, we gain a fresh sense of the richness of classical culture, recognize anew the extraordinary but also extraordinarily problematic legacy that we've inherited from antiquity. So if you have problems with neoliberalism, so too. Plato had problems with the kind of unconstrained money-making that he saw as a problem in his own time. And we can appreciate anew the depth and breadth of classical scholarship. If I hadn't Dodds to work with, if I hadn't read Bernard Williams, as well as a whole mass of other work by people like Leslie Kirk and Emily Mackell, for example, wouldn't be possible for me to do what I do. But I think it does give us a sense to think about the breadth of scholarship. But also how much there is left to do. How taking something that seems quite far from the classical world, using it as a filter to rethink about some aspects of the classical world, I think potentially opens up a lot of potentially good new work. Well, that's it. Thank you very much. I meant to say we were going to solve all the problems of modernity, but that seemed almost a little too hopeful for today. So,
unlike the conventional Sathers, we are taking questions. So anyone have a remark, a question? You will have to grab the mic if you want to ask. Daniela.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Josh. That was lovely. A great way to spend a Saturday lunchtime. I wanted various questions and thoughts, but I wondered if we could just briefly go back to the Agamemnon example from the beginning. Not necessarily the slide. Sorry, I didn't mean that. But
the first.
We don't need to go back to the slide. No, don't worry. But I was just wondering what you might think, or what you think Dodds might have thought of the possibility that ascribing Agamemnon's madness to Ate could itself be read as a rational move, in that it offers an opportunity for kind of both Agamemnon and Achilles to agree over a kind of face-saving gesture. So it wouldn't, I think, to assume that there's maybe something intrinsically irrational about Ate might be a mistake of Dodds's, because you might, one might think that given the social norms and so on, it completely makes sense in the same way that it would make sense for someone today to say, it was a moment of madness, I was crazy. It doesn't necessarily need to be read as a genuine commitment to irrationality. It could actually be read as a sop or a kind of a gesture towards mutual agreement that we'll call it that. That's great, and then we can continue to have a relationship in the future.
Yeah, no, thanks, Daniela. That's great, and I think that makes lots of sense, because if Achilles sticks to his homo prosokaio piso argument, it says you had a perfectly clear way to do things right. You failed. You failed me. You failed the army. No. That it's unforgivable that you simply made this choice when the obvious answer was clearly in front of you and you did this other thing. You need something if you're ever going to get resolution, which we have to get resolution because we have to get Achilles back on the battlefield, so on. So agreeing to say, okay, it's this external thing, that you weren't at least entirely responsible for your own behavior, I think is, as you say, face-saving. It doesn't sort of, as it were, as we might think it would if they say, well, it was entirely this external thing, and therefore there's no reason for Agamemnon to bring all these extra gifts along with, okay, return the girl, but what are all these extra gifts? No, I mean, obviously there's sort of, in a sense, yes, you are responsible and you have to pay that back. You have to make that, you might have to make that right. But I think that's a great point, is that irrationality, or as it were, attributing behavior to irrationality, does sometimes allow people in antiquity, maybe people in modernity, to say, yeah, we can go on. I don't know what I was saying. Did I say that? Just something came over me.
Exactly.
I'm sure no one in this room has ever been in that position.
Thank you. Thank you very
Great.
much.
Duncan.
Thank you, Josh. That was very entertaining. I do have just a thought about this Hama prosokaio piso. There is someone in the poem, or presence in the poem, who must always do that, which is the poet, who has to always know what they're currently saying, but also what they've said and what they want to say. Yeah. And to your point that there are kind of foreclosed futures where Agamemnon could just sort of act rationally. It's the poet has to imagine that. So it's striking to me that formula describes the sort of condition of the Homeric poet. But my question is actually about a different character in the poem, which is Zeus and his boule. Mm-hmm. And your kind of hair-raisingly Spinozist understanding of Apollo as nature. So I kind of wonder about, let's say the rationality of the gods, since in some ways the poem is driven by a boule, which content is unknown and it's difficult to understand exactly what instrumental goal it would be following, though the language of boule is the language of this instrumental choice, right? So I kind of wonder a little bit, I think I've asked you this question before in relation to the original lectures. I wonder how much you're willing for the gods to, in some ways, be sucked into this sort of set of agents and not just be a kind of rather dispassionate sort of change point in which it's 50-50 or,
Yeah. So no, it's a very good point. And on your first point about the homoprosokaiopiso being basically the poet's point of view, I think is really right. I should check again. I haven't double-checked all of the other three, but certainly in a couple of them, it is in fact in the poet's voice that you get the statement that such and such was not able to, or another one was the only one who was able to do this thing, look forwards and backwards. So I think the Achilles case may be the only one in which we actually get the character focalizing. I'll have to once again double check that, but it would be an interesting thing if that's true. I'd sort of like to work a little bit more on this. Making the gods just simply into nature is really just a way to make it work in a game theoretic form. It looks to me as if Apollo doesn't have preferences over outcomes here. He is basically responding to the demand for reciprocity by Chryses. He doesn't seem to have any. He doesn't have any problem turning off the plague when Chryses says, okay, time to make it go. Okay, fine, click it off. It's not that now I'm actually sort of enjoying wiping out the Achaeans, or I have various of the gods do have a dog in the fight, obviously. Apollo doesn't seem to be one of them. So in this case, I don't have too much problem with it. In terms of the boule, it's a famous crux in Homeric scholarship. Does it refer to this this idea that we get outside of the epic, that Zeus had a plan to exterminate the entire human race, and that was it? I don't think that's it. I take it as simply the plan to continue to hurt the Achaean cause until Achilles comes back. And that gives plenty of space for all of the bloodshed and dog-eaten corpses and so on that come from the plan. In this case, Zeus, unlike Apollo, does have a preference. He doesn't really want to do this. He's made to do this by his reciprocal obligations to Thetis. So it'd be harder to make Zeus into that kind of quasi-nature thing. That's just a probability function. So yes, one has to be careful about doing that, and I wouldn't say generically that the gods simply become a probability over outcomes. But I think in the Apollo case, it works pretty well.
Could I just follow up on Duncan's point? Because it hadn't occurred to me to think of homoprosokaiopiso as applying to the poet's point of view. But I think it's one of those things that once you hear it seems clearly right. But then, Josh, if you're going to work more on this, and by the way, thank you for today. It reminded me why I enjoyed your original Sather lectures so much. But is there a possibility that Achilles means by that phrase here something much simpler than your game theoretical analysis would suggest, namely, Agamemnon is unable to, unlike the poet, rise above himself and stop thinking selfishly, stop worrying about purely in terms of his own dignity, and because he's thue, he's not thinking, as we would say, never mind thinking game theoretically, and to because it's kind of hard to think hama at the very same time, backwards and forwards, unless you are a poet and or a kind of God who can rise above the scene. But what that phrase seems to, so it applies very well to the poet's disinterested perspective, but less well, I think, to your game tree here, in that I see you've got the proso and the opiso, and you want the god to be occupying, but this view, but again, if we take Duncan's point, are the gods really rising above the fray? Someone who's certainly not rising above the fray is, and looking backwards and forwards, is someone who is thinking rationally at the beginning of that tree. So far as I can see, why isn't he just looking forwards? He's thinking, if I do this, then this is going to happen. And then if I do this next thing, and oh God, it's all going to cascade, and I'm going to end up in a much worse situation than I'm in now. Therefore, I should not do it. But that's just sort of future-oriented. It's selfish, future-oriented thinking. And maybe Achilles is asking for something simpler, something. Agamemnon should not be so damn unselfish in this, so completely not like acting like a leader in this situation.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I am happy to think that that's certainly there too. The whole point, of this kind of thing is indeed backwards induction. So you have to work. This is what just every game theorist says. You work up and down the game tree, and so. As you get up here, you should then knock off the ones that aren't to your advantage, and you should end up at the one that is advantageous to yourself. You have to have worked all the way up and then all the way back down to get to where you are to make the right decision. Yeah, I mean it's in order because homo prosokai piso has this chronological sense. It's a complicated phrase. There've been questions of which comes first, but it does think about going forwards and backwards in some kind of a chronological way, and that is just exact.
Do you have a place for hama in your?
Well, yeah, because that's what backwards induction is doing. I mean, we have to do it one thing at a time. But you've got to be doing this as a gestalt, right? I mean, I don't know if hama requires at the same instantaneous moment of time, but I think it must mean in the same sort of process of ratiocination that you have completed before actually acting. And so, I think in that sense, it does sort of capture, once again, this need to go up and then come back down to where I am and make my decision. That's just, about as tidy as a statement, sort of folk version of a backwards induction, I think, as I know, frankly, anywhere in antiquity. And interestingly, it comes at the very beginning. There's lots of backward induction, right? Aristotle, the whole teleology requires all kinds of backward induction, right? You understand the telos, and you want to work all the way back through the subsidiary ends and the means to those ends to what you ought to be doing right now, right? So if you're an Aristotelian teleologist, you're doing backwards induction all the time. So, there are sophisticated versions of this, but in terms of just stating it in a phrase, this is about as good as it gets.
Other questions? Maybe I'll have the privilege of holding the mic to ask you to say, I'm very interested in the sort of tension between rational thinking and ethical reasoning. And you hinted throughout and then sort of were more explicit in your conclusions about the point that the group you call the classical eudaimonists were engaged in a kind of critical enterprise against this sort of, I think, rising, I don't know if we want to say rising, but rational thought. And at the same time that they used the principles of rational thought in their own arguments. And I wonder if you could just sort of, I mean, I know you did some of this in the book, but just to sort of flesh out the sense for this group of maybe some of the ways in which maybe a different substantive argument, that sort of process of critical engagement with the sort of underpinning or with the results of rational thought could have been pursued without giving up the rational thinking itself as a kind of intellectual method.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Plato, Aristotle are deeply committed to reason, whatever they're committed to. It is to reason, to rationality. And one way to think about it is that they just see their vision of reason, of rationality, as absolutely in contrast to this instrumental rationality of the sophists, let us say, just for shorthand. So their commitment to rationality is what I sometimes call just ethical rationality. That is, you must have the right ends that you're aiming at in order to be rational. If you're aiming at ends that are actually not the best ends that are not actually good for you, you cannot be said in a eudaimonious sort of conception to be truly rational. So therefore, anyone who is being completely instrumentally rational and aiming at a bad end gets, as it were, excluded from the world of the truly rational. So I think that's all pretty straightforward. The argument I want to make is that Plato and Aristotle needed instrumental rationality as a background, even as a foundation, for the kind of ethical rationality that they thought was of true value. You weren't going to be able to gain the ends of ethical rationality without the conditions, the material conditions that are going to be generated by the correct application of instrumental rationality. So the whole point is keeping instrumental rationality under control, under the control of higher reason, right? Under the control of ethical reason, so that you can have what Aristotle would call the external goods, and they can be sufficiently profuse and of the right sort, so you can have for Plato, the kinds of goods that you need to get your first polis up and running. But always the danger that instrumental form of rationality, saying that, yes, it's all means to ends, and I'll decide on what the ends are. Or, I was talking to this clever sophist, and he told me what the ends are. Or my, grandfather was a great moneymaker, and he told me what the ends are. All of these are terrible mistakes from the point of view of the rational eudaimonist. The point is then that there is a genuine difference between the way in which, thinking about a world in which we just reduce it to rational choice and the ends that we choose, the goals, utility, call it, is just a black box. It's whatever anybody happens to prefer, which is basically the way most economists think about it. So there's a big difference between that and the idea of true rationality, having the right goal, the right end, and that what makes the whole ethical rationality into an objective rather than a subjective undertaking, which is part of what makes it interesting, and of course makes it troubling for people who are committed to a certain form of subjectivity.
I think that we should thank Professor Ober and continue the conversation over a drink. unless there are any more burning questions. Is there one? I'm so sorry. Okay.
Thank you so much for this lovely presentation. I do think passages in the symposium affirm what you're saying. And I think the start of our talk today, your talk today, advantageous to oneself is hardly the end that Plato or Socrates would really recommend. It's in the symposium, Plato, I think, says what we want is the good for ourselves forever.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we want.
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciate your allowing us to understand better, what the more mundane version of rationality is. We call it practical wisdom or instrumental thinking. And the more, well, I don't want to use the word ideal. It seems true to me in the symposium when Plato argues that, just like in the allegory of the cave, the sunlight floods, the world so that we can actually see what is good. And I think that's what the end of eudaimonia is, and the way that people might come closer to securing it. Thank you.
Lovely thought. Thank you.